Doug talked to me about doing this. He indicated that he was looking for an encouraging passage, an encouraging word. And not too long ago in our assembly meeting, somebody made reference to Daniel 3, and I don't know that I could think of any really a more encouraging passage than that. So I thought that we would look at that passage today in regards to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in particular. And I know that, it's obviously in the book of Daniel, so there's a pretty high prophetic content to the material there. But I really wanted to look at it from the standpoint, from a more personal standpoint, in terms of what might have been going on in the hearts of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what kind of preparation they might have had to bring them to that point of giving the testimony that they gave to Nebuchadnezzar at that time. So I think we should probably read a few of the verses from the chapter to get a little background as to how they get to the point where they make their declaration, and we'll see where we go from there. So starting with chapter 3 and verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, governors, captains, judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornets, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So stop just for a second here and notice a few things. The first one, I guess, might say have something to do with Nebuchadnezzar and his situation. In the second chapter of Daniel, when Daniel interprets his dream, he indicates to Nebuchadnezzar that he was that head of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had seen in the dream. And I don't think it's coincidental now that Nebuchadnezzar isn't building an image of a head of gold. He's building a whole image of gold. So I think perhaps he got to a point where it was all about him at this point. And it indicates that the height of the image that he made was 60 cubits and the breadth 6 cubits, which the 6 being the number of the man, which of course can't help but think about looking forward to the end where there's a beast that has a 666 number. But so obviously this had taken hold of Nebuchadnezzar, but he's not really the subject of what we wanted to talk about. We do notice that these folks that were called from the provinces, it says, there were 8 groups of people that were called there: the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces. So we also, if we had read the second chapter, we would have seen that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego actually were rulers of the province of Babylon. Daniel had asked for them that they have that position, and so they would have been included in this group of people that was called together, probably a pretty sizable group. I don't know how many provinces were in Babylon at this time. We know from the book of Esther, which is actually in point of time, I believe, later than this. Darius had a kingdom that had 127 provinces in it. What the number is for Babylon, I don't know, but it was a goodly number of people. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have been part of the group of people that was called there. So in the second verse that we read, Nebuchadnezzar gathered those people together. The third verse, rather, they were gathered together. I'm sorry. The second verse, he called them together, and then the third, by the time we get to the third verse, they had actually been gathered together. Now, what period of time intervenes in there, I'm not totally certain. But at any rate, at that point, they're gathered together. And when they are gathered together, then the herald cries aloud and gives them some instructions. And his instructions go from verses 4 to 6. And I believe that in the verse 6 there, where he says, whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth the same hour will be cast into the burning fiery furnace. I believe that's the first time that the furnace was mentioned. I don't know that the furnace was mentioned when the invitation to these folks went out. Now, I'm bringing that up again, primarily for background for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's like, and the question that arises in my mind is, how much did they know about what was going to happen? Did this come upon them suddenly? And how does that impact their response or their state of readiness for when this event comes upon them? And, we're going to kind of look at that kind of aspect of things and try to, think about ourselves. If such an event would come up in our lives, would we be ready for it? Would we be able to respond in the same way that they did, in a way that honors God and we would be happy about for eternity? So, again, the fact that this isn't mentioned until now about the burning fiery furnace, it may have come up as suddenly, which might indicate they didn't have any time to think about it. And so, and again, that's going to play into, at least into my thinking about, what might they have gone through in order to get to the place where they ended up. Okay, so I'm sorry, my voice is I'm going to get some coffee here. Getting a little dry. So they're called together. They do in fact blow then the trumpet. And in verse 7 it says, therefore at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So Nebuchadnezzar had sent out, he had gathered them, called them together. They were actually gathered together. They went through this dedication and were given the edict that if they didn't bow down, they would be cast in the burning fiery furnace. Verse 7 indicates that virtually everyone did bow down. But of course, we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. And so again, the question might be, if we were to put ourselves in their shoes, did they know that this was coming, that they were going to have to bow down? It was billed as the invitation seemed to be come to the dedication of the image. Perhaps, they didn't know that they were going to have to do this, and whether they did or they didn't know ahead of time, we know that they didn't do it. And so that's to their credit. And again, if we were to put ourselves in some kind of situation, perhaps like that, and I believe the situations of this kind of nature do come up occasionally in people's lives and perhaps in everyone's life. There's some moment of decision when, you need to make a stand for the Lord, and how do we do? And what does it take to be in a position that we would respond the way that the Lord would want us to respond? So we know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. And then if we go on to verse 8, it says there were certain of the Chaldeans that came near and accused the Jews. And they went to Nebuchadnezzar and with this information about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And that's really how we know that they didn't bow down. And so this puts them in the hot seat. Let's go ahead and read through the verses themselves. Verse 8, wherefore at a certain time the Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth, he should be cast into the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews who thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. So our guys here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not bow down. And they are being called before the king to answer for this. It's no fun really for anyone to be accused of anyone. And so these guys were out to get the Jews, and they brought this charge for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before the king. So we get then Nebuchadnezzar going into a rage, and in the next few verses here, and to see if he could put them on the hot seat and make them to cave and to bow down. And so verse 13 says that Nebuchadnezzar was in a rage and a fury, and he brought them before him. And Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? And he doesn't wait for an answer. He basically says, now you're going to do this in my presence? And again, if we think about that, it's like I said, they're on the hot seat. And if we were there, how would we respond? What would be going through your hearts or my heart if we were in a situation like that? And so he puts the pressure on. Now, if ye be ready, verse 15, at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? So there it is. Nebuchadnezzar puts it out to them. If I were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you might be feeling one way initially, but when he gets to that last statement, I think I would have breathed a sigh of relief because basically Nebuchadnezzar has just challenged God, and we know how that's going to work out. So let's go ahead and read their response, starting at verse 16 here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. 3 verses. I don't know how many words. I didn't count them. I know it takes less than 30 seconds to read. And this is their response. And this is a gem of a response. Might say, even I've likened it to a diamond. Why is that? It's multiple facets in it. Okay, it's crystal clear in its delivery from these guys. It's strong, and it has fire in it for the glory of God. And so this is what I think of this passage. This is what's so encouraging to me, is that they could come up and say this with such clarity, such certainty, such unreserved trust in God at a time like this, when everything is at stake for them, really. Everything. And how did they do that? Why? What caused them to be able to do that? Okay. Let's go backwards now and try and answer that question. How could they be? What is it that brought them into this state? What could we model from them? What could we borrow from them that might help us to make sure that we're in a state that would allow us to respond in such a way under such pressure? Okay, well, if we go, really, all that we know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is basically in these first 3 chapters of the book of Daniel. So, well, we're going to have to find our answers in here. We go back to the beginning. We find that they, in chapter 1 and verse 4, that they were among a certain group of children in whom was no blemish, verse 4, but they were well favored, skillful in wisdom and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability to stand in the king's palace. Okay, well, this is who they are, but is that helpful in getting where we want to be, to know what it is that these guys had that caused them to be able to stand for their God and give an answer the way they did? And I would say no to that question, because I think there were a number of other children in that group that were in the same position that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, and didn't respond in the way that they did. But what do we find? We find in verse 6, now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Okay, there's 4 of them here. These 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are grouped with Daniel. So one thing we could say out of here is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they had good friends. They had friends that would encourage them in the Lord. They're connected here with Daniel, and we know from this first chapter that it was basically Daniel's exercise that gained them a certain amount of favor and ascendancy in the kingdom. Verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank, and therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So here's these young people. They're taken away from their homeland. They're captives, it tells us, and they're brought to this place, and now they're going to be tried to be integrated and converted into Babylonian society. How do they respond? How would they respond to that? Well, there was one person there, Daniel, who wasn't willing to just accept the situation. They might very well have thought, well, there's really nothing we can do about it. We really have no choice. Daniel didn't accept that and put himself in the Lord's hands, and maybe took a step back and said, well, Lord, what can we do so that we don't have to defile you or dishonor you in this? And he came up with this plan to be tested, to see, if they could eat their their pulse and not have the Babylonian food. And if after 10 days, they didn't look any worse than anyone else, they'd get to continue. Well, the Lord honored that. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they were confederate with Daniel in that. It doesn't say that it was their idea, but they did it along with him. And they were confederate with Daniel in that, and they won. And so they got to not defile themselves, and the Lord honored that. And it says in verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill and all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in dreams and visions. So it's after they go through this event where they take a step back, and even though they had no real leverage, they had a desire, a purpose in their heart not to defile the Lord, and the Lord honored that and gave them wisdom and understanding. And then so in verse 6 it mentions the 4 of them together. Then again in verse 11 it mentions the 4 of them together. And so that was the one thing that we can say is that they joined themselves to people who would help encourage them in the Lord and perhaps even strengthen them beyond their own capabilities into doing what's right in the sight of the Lord. Now, I would also say that this is an example, going along with Daniel in this, of a faith-building experience that these guys had and apparently laid hold of and took to heart, that was preparatory in allowing them, when the time came, to take and make the stand that they did. This is the first example. It's not the only one. But we find then in verse 19 of chapter 1 that when the king communed with them, that is Nebuchadnezzar had talked with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, and it says, in all manner of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. 10 times better. That's pretty impressive. And so King Nebuchadnezzar would have been familiar with them. At that point, I don't know that King Nebuchadnezzar would have known what had transpired, how they had honored their God or not, but that no doubt, that incident with Daniel would have encouraged them in the Lord, giving them probably a perspective of the Lord that they might not have had otherwise, that apparently others who were in that same category with them, that same group with them, never got. And that's the beginnings of what I think the second and perhaps the main ingredient to their success is the view of God that they had, and how big that view is, and how much they realized what the God of Israel could do for them. Now we have to remember that, again, they're captives, and it would have been easy, I think, for them to say that, well, our God didn't deliver us from the hand of the Babylonians in the first place, and what are we doing here? This is, can we trust them? Is there any hope for us? But they didn't say that. And, we don't really know what all went on, but I mean, there could have been those that said that. It would have been a natural reaction. We would see it in other places, perhaps. But instead of that, there's a realization that regardless of the fact that Israel was captive to these Babylonians, that their God was the God and the creator of the universe, and their God could work things out for them. And their God, even if he allowed them to be carried into captivity into Babylon, was still the God of all the earth, and still the one who deserves to be honored and obeyed by all men. And so I think they learned part of that lesson there. The next incident that that there is what happens in the second chapter, where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream, and his wise men couldn't interpret it and tell him the dream and the meaning. And he was going to have all the wise men in the kingdom put to death, which would have included Daniel and Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they were, in a sense, at the point of death there as well. And again, it's Daniel who goes in and desires of the king, verse 16, that he would give him time and that he would show him the interpretation of the king's dream. And then it says in verse 17, Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that, verse 18, they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret. So here again, the situation is desperate. They're essentially at the point of death, and yet these four, and again, it was Daniel who went in, and of course he was the one that was given interpretations of dreams that was mentioned earlier, but these four together come apart, they get down on their knees, and they lay hold of the God of heaven to seek mercies of him and to do for them what, naturally speaking, couldn't be done, to give that dream to them so that they could go to King Nebuchadnezzar and not only tell him what the interpretation of the dream was, but what the dream itself was. So again, this is another incident in their life where they actually see the deliverance of God in a mighty way, a supernatural way. And so I think this is a key ingredient in how they respond, how they view God. And I really think that is something that needs to be before us all. What is our view of him? We see when there's are different ones in scripture that have that clear view of who the Lord is. And we're really talking about it in a practical standpoint, because I think all of us would acknowledge the fact that God is, great, and there's nothing too hard for him. And yet in a practical way, and in our daily lives, sometimes we don't always act on it the way we ought. But you get a guy like David who sees the situation with this giant as, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that defies the armies of the living God? He didn't see the fact that the giant was twice as big as he was, or, that he was just a boy, and, the giant was a man of war from his youth. All he saw was that his God had been insulted. What is it that brings a Mary to anoint the head of Jesus on the night before his death? It's her appreciation of who he is, to the point that, got a box of ointment that's worth a year's wages. He's worth it. He's worth it. That was the point. So when there's that appreciation of who the Lord is, and, that's what I think gives us the ability to overcome the world and even these situations. And, beyond that, to make them realize that, following God and obeying God is worth more than even life itself. And so I think that's what brings them to their point then in verse 13. Really, it's at verse 16 where they give their response. Is they have the right view of who God is. And so Nebuchadnezzar, again, he comes to this point. He thinks he should be bowed down and worship, and he goes so far as to challenge the God of heaven. And you know how that's going to work out. Sorry, Nebuchadnezzar. There's a real God in heaven. And these men knew who that God was, and they weren't going to bow down to him. We would, if we would go back in history a little bit to the Assyrians, we find that when they challenged God in the days of Hezekiah, don't let Hezekiah tell you that your God's going to save them. None of the other gods of the nations have saved them. And Hezekiah takes that letter and goes in and lays it out before God and says, look what he says about you, And of course, the Lord didn't allow that to stand, and Sennacherib had to go back to his own land and never even cast a bank against Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar kind of does the same thing here. The moment he made that challenge, you kind of knew that things were not going to end well for him. But we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response. So let's take a look at a little bit now at what they actually said to him. Okay, that first statement in verse 16, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. What they're really saying to Nebuchadnezzar is, we didn't even have to think about this. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to talk. We don't need to take a counsel together. We just don't even have to, because the answer is already known. So there's that aspect of their response, that it's a complete trust in God. It's a complete a recognition, rather, of the God who they serve, that he is the God who could and would deliver them out of the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I understand that although it says we are not careful to answer this in this matter in the King James, that it's more frequently translated, we don't need to answer you in this matter. And if we would take it up on that ground, why would it be that they didn't need to? Well, King Nebuchadnezzar really had already had an encounter with that God already, and so he would have known at this point that who this God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was. If we go back to the 47th verse of the 2nd chapter, it says, of a truth that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. So Nebuchadnezzar had already encountered this God, and he had made those statements out of his own mouth. So this was the God that he had already been forced to acknowledge. And so they didn't need to respond, because Nebuchadnezzar already knew who that God was. And so they continue, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. They knew he was. They had proved him. That was their view. They recognized that he was, there was nothing too hard for him, this God. And their trust is completely in him. And again, we've all trusted the Lord as our Savior. And, we trust him day by day, but in a practical way, sometimes we do things that indicate maybe we're not trusting quite as much as we ought to be. But these guys were, they were completely ready to put their whole lives in his hand. They didn't know if he would deliver them for sure. They thought he would. But if he didn't, then it didn't really matter, because, for them to worship a false God was against the real God, who they knew very well. And so they said, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Okay, so they knew they were ready to die if that's what it took. They were already ready to do that. And again, I believe that's because of they recognized who God was and what was due him. And they were trusting him. You can tell they're putting it all in God's hands, and God can do with us what he wants to. And so that was their response. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, doesn't like to hear that. And so he heats up the furnace, and they realize that if things don't go the way they expect, that they're going to have to endure the king's wrath, but they're ready for that. And they don't, there's no sign of they're pushing back or resisting what the king is intending to put on them. And Nebuchadnezzar commands that his most mighty men in verse 20 and his army bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And so they were bound. They were bound just the way they were, and they were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So God does not deliver them from the fiery furnace, and yet God delivers them from the burning fiery furnace, because they were cast in, and the men who cast them in perished, and yet all the fire did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was set them free. So verse 21, these men were bound in their coats and their hoses and their hats and their garments, and were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said unto the king, true, O king. And he answered and said, lo, I see four men loosed walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. So now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even though they were cast into the burning fiery furnace, they were loose. The fire, all that did was set them free. It killed the ones who threw them in there, but they were set free. And furthermore, there was another who joined them, one like unto the Son of God. And so the fire has no hurt on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It can do nothing to them because they're under the protection of God. Those who are not under the protection of God suffer from the violence of the fire. And of course, this brings astonishment to Nebuchadnezzar. And he tells them to come forth and come hither. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire, and all those princes and governors and captains and kings, they got to look at these men as they came out. It might have been an interesting thing for them to experience, as they were no doubt watched as they were cast in, but now they're watching them come out of the fire where they should have been dead, but they're not. And so Nebuchadnezzar then, because of the faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar has to make some statements here. In the first one, 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants. So they were delivered. He changed the king's word. Okay, they yielded their bodies that they might not serve or worship any god except their own. So Nebuchadnezzar gets this testimony he had to acknowledge that this was a God who could, in fact, deliver out of his hands. So they were ready to go into that furnace. Again, I believe in the main because of that view of God that they had and their complete trust in him. And the Lord honored that faith. And this item is recorded. It's one of the most really, in terms of triumph of believers, it's one of the most enjoyable ones from Scripture. To me, I would surmise that in Hebrews 11, where it talks about those quenching the violence of fire, that it's referring back to these. You know, these are men of like passions, such as we. And again, you know, if probably these defining events of some sort or other come into everyone's lives, and I think we would all like to be in a position to respond the right way when they come. And so what we, of course, need is to draw near to the Lord and have our eyes open to see his glory and his beauty and his excellence, and that we would have that appreciation for who he is. And that, I think, is really what is going to cause us, in probably all cases, to do the right things if we have a proper appreciation for who the Lord is. And so may the Lord grant it to us. I really think that's all I've got for now. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Mark, for good comments, a good study on those three. If there are any questions, are you open to a little question and answer period? Oh.
You're welcome to ask. Whether I can answer or not is another question.
It is nice to see, Mark, how the Lord prepared them. I don't think I'd ever quite noticed it before. You know, the Lord just doesn't spring something on us, does he?
That's true.
He's not trying to show us up. He is trying to teach us. I think in Isaiah it says, ask me about my sons. He's, you might say, like a father being proud of his children. Each one of us are his workmanship. And he's going to bring us, as you say, into the experiences and the company that prepare us for the worst. We think of the fire as being the worst, but you know, there's many here that have been through things that, in my judgment, would be worse. You know, fire is a pretty quick end, as the men of Nebuchadnezzar proved. But God knows, and the Lord is very careful with us. He's not trying to show us up. He's trying to teach us and bring us more into the likeness of his Son.
If a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. We get a little picture of that with these three men and Daniel. That's a principle that we can depend on. We may not always be delivered like they were. We're in a different dispensation, but nevertheless,
I think that's the first time, if I'm not mistaken, that we have collective prayer in the Word. We have numerous times where people cried unto the Lord as a tribe or as a group. But I think that's the first time someone got together with a few of his friends and prayed specifically about a certain matter.
I was noticing as I went through this that I don't believe either Shadrach, Meshach, or Abednego is ever mentioned apart from the other two. And I was thinking about a little bit, the collective aspect that's there, and what a nice thing it is for them to be able to act in unison like that, and mindful of how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. But there's probably some other thoughts connected with that. But I think there's something of a collective aspect that we can learn from that as well.
I really enjoyed that, Mark. Thanks very much for sharing that with us.
Quite welcome.
I just wanted to make a comment about the preparatory work that God was working in these men. They were men of faith and walking in communion with God. I think it would, if they hadn't been men of faith, and if they had been walking in communion with God, he wouldn't have been able to prepare them for what they had to endure. And it's interesting that, and you see a progression here where they're tested for this, when Daniel goes to Nebuchadnezzar and asks for time to make the interpretation of the dream. And if I'm not mistaken, Nebuchadnezzar proved him by basically saying, "Tell me what I dreamed, and then give me the interpretation." I may be wrong in that, but I think that's I'd have to go back and read it. But I think that's another test that he had, and then finally we have them not bowing down to this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had put up, which was an even greater test. So you see a progression. You see a progression there as well. And well, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's interesting, Paul. I think Bob Toney mentioned recently in a meeting that it was a beautiful thought. I thought that I always thought that Nebuchadnezzar had forgotten the dream, but his fresh look at it seemed to yield the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was very wise, and he knew that his wise men were tricking, and they are always, like a fortune teller asks you a few questions and then gets an idea of your character and background, and then they pretend that they can tell the future. And that's what these men were that surrounded Nebuchadnezzar. They were nothing but charlatans. And Bob suggested that he knew the dream, but that was like, what do we say in software? It was the double security that he knew the dream, and if they missed any detail, he would know they didn't know the dream. He knew the dream, so they were to tell him the dream so he would know they were worthy of interpretation. And I thought that was really nice, really interesting. How perfect God is, and we know he can he welcomes the hard questions, doesn't he? He welcomes the things that are impossible are the things that our Lord does.
Of us don't have the faith, and we're a little weak. And I was thinking of two men, Gideon and Barak. The Lord told Gideon that he was going to be with him. And Gideon said, "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with me, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles?" Barak also was living in those times when every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Israel was being faced with the king of Canaan. The Lord raised up Deborah, prophetess, sign of weakness, to have her. And she asked Barak if he will go to war with her. And Barak is weak in faith. He says, I think if I can find it here, he says, "If thou wilt go with me, then I will go. But if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go." And later on in the chapter, Deborah says to Barak, "For this is the day in which the Lord hath delivered us." You notice it's Deborah saying unto Barak. It's not Barak saying to Deborah. Both of these men don't have the faith that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had. But I think it's very encouraging because Mark did mention that in Hebrews 11 that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are, I suppose, suggested. That's who Paul was referring to in writing the book of Hebrews. But then he says, "And what shall I more say? For the time shall fall me to speak of Gideon and of Barak." So that was an encouragement to me that maybe we are a Gideon, maybe we are a Barak. But in times of weakness, such as we're living in today, the Lord has not forgotten a little bit of faith we have.
And Hebrews 11, Doug, is completion of faith, isn't it? We see the individuals with just a little faith, but God in Hebrews 11 is talking about those that are the fruit of the author and finisher of faith. And so he sees the faith as complete. You know, it's not little pieces of faith in Hebrews 11. It is a completed life, completed work through the power and the grace of God that brings each one of us through whatever we need to learn right up to the end where God can say a complete faith.
Mark, I have a question. I wonder if you've thought about this. It may be the answer may be in the different dispensations as has been mentioned that's a prominent feature, but from where we live now. But we are in these times instructed and have been instructed by many brethren in the principles of Scripture that if you are exalted to a significant, powerful position in this world, it's going to become a trap. Now, for a Christian, and we see many Christians who have felt that to go into something significant like politics. I can be a help, and I can represent the Lord there in the councils of men and be a help in making things better than they would otherwise be. But we are generally instructed to not engage in that. Now here where Daniel first and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego elevated to significant power positions in that realm. So I just wondered if you had thought about whether they had flunked that test in order to get them to where these other tests came on, because they did have powerful positions.
I hadn't really thought of about that. I guess the only thing I would say really to that is, they were captives, and they were in one sense servants from that standpoint, good servants, albeit. I guess you do have Daniel in the 49th verse of the second chapter requesting the promotion of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but I don't think Nebuchadnezzar would have done it if it weren't good for his kingdom. So from that standpoint, maybe they're not quite responsible in the same way as we're talking about, but I'd be open to other thoughts on it.
I remember a brother having a meeting here once, and he said, if my son became the general manager of General Motors, I would be devastated. And in a different dispensation, it would be different. I believe God put these men here, gave them the ability, and it was recognized by Nebuchadnezzar, as well as the godliness of these men. I believe it was a certain amount of fear and perhaps respect on the part of Nebuchadnezzar. But that's, like as we mentioned, it's a total different dispensation. It was okay then, but it's not really God's mind now. We are ambassadors for a heavenly country, and I have no business getting involved. As ambassadors, you're supposed to be telling the country about your own country, not getting involved in the politics of the country in which you are an ambassador. So it's a totally different thing, isn't it? But we have principles, and I believe it's good to follow these principles that above all things, that God honors those that honor him.
The way things are nowadays is different than how things used to be even during the 1800s. In a country like England, sometimes the government, or you might say the Queen or King, would tap people and put them into a position. Mm-hmm. And that was an appointment. And we have that, for example, with Rowland Hill, who analyzed the postal system and said it would be better if the people that sent the envelopes put stamps on them. And so they appointed him into that position. He did not run for office. It was the ruler of that country saying, I'm appointing you as the postmaster general. Yeah. And so we don't have that today in our country. And if we look at it in that way, it doesn't make sense. But I think that what Daniel and his three friends were in, it was more that sort of a position where the head of the country appointed them.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a quick comment on a verse that I noticed this morning in Jeremiah 29, that would be very applicable to this situation. It doesn't directly answer the question, but if you read Jeremiah 29 and verse 7, this was Jeremiah writing a letter to the captives. And of course, they would have been in an extremely unique position where never before would the children of Israel be wanting to help their enemies. But the verse there in Jeremiah 29, verse 7 says, "And seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof ye shall have peace." Anyway, just a verse to consider when thinking about this.
I think that's an interesting verse relevant to what we were talking about.
Just real quick, does someone have a thought? I'm noticing, God does, our Lord does a lot of things at once. And it seems like these 4 chapters in Daniel are really the education of Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
He progresses chapter to chapter. I'm sure someone else would have something more to say than I would. But then also in chapter 5, we see another player that's been affected by the faithfulness of these men, and that is Nebuchadnezzar's queen, who witnesses to her son, who makes a grievous error. She understands the power of God, and she understands the position of Daniel in the kingdom.
I have a question about this fiery furnace here. It did not consume these men, as we know. They were harmless in that fire. And I've thought of that verse in Hebrews where it says, "Our God is a consuming fire." Do we see a contrast here? I think of that expression, falsehoods, fire, and so forth. This fire did not harm them, but yet, on the other hand, our God is a consuming fire. And I was thinking of the time that Elijah called down fire and it consumed the altar and so forth. I'd just be interested in any comments that any of you might have on this. Thank you.
Not sure we would call the fire that Nebuchadnezzar put on, God's fire. Man's fire, maybe. But, so that fire had no power over them.
But the trial was certainly a fire that was sent by God. So
I would just notice that I liked what you said, Mark, about verse 16 in chapter 3. "We are not careful to answer thee in this matter." Like you said, God had already answered him. So they hide under that umbrella. But they are, even though they are in the service, in the furnace, and their bonds have been burned, they are still servants of the king. And he calls them forth, and they come in obedience.
Well, Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant. He says that. He calls him his servant, doesn't he? And so it would be wrong for them not to submit to Nebuchadnezzar.
That's the end of chapter 4, isn't it? It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Very clarifying. Souls to read that. The end of chapter 4.
The problem with what happened to the children of Judah there when in the times of Jeremiah, he tried to warn them. He said, if you submit to the king, my servant Nebuchadnezzar, you'll be safe. But if you don't, you're going to die. And a lot of the people, just like today, probably, if we as Christians rise up and do not submit to the authorities that God has, we're in the days of the Gentiles, times of the Gentiles, so we are to submit to the powers that be that God has put in place, and not fight against it. If we do, we're going to be destroyed in our souls, I believe. So how important it is that whatever God has put in place, we submit to that. And so it was with these young men here. They submitted to Nebuchadnezzar as God's servant. They realized they had been put in a place there because of the unfaithfulness of their king and their people. And then, of course, reading further in Jeremiah, and as Daniel noticed later on, there was going to be a time limit to this whole thing.
Matthew 10:28 also has a portion here. It says, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul and body in hell." So they had the right fear. They didn't fear the king because they couldn't kill the soul, but they feared the Lord, whom the king ended up being able to fear once he was brought into the wisdom and knowledge of God concerning that matter.